Start.
All right, we're going to get started. Hi, my name is Mike Conlow. I work for a company called Blue State Digital. We are based in New York, and this is Jeff. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. And we're going to talk about a platform that we built along with UNICEF that allows them to take donations all across the world in up to 135 currencies and in 7 languages, and how we did that. So we'll introduce ourselves. We'll talk a little bit about UNICEF and how they've been moving towards Drupal, including for this platform. We'll go through the site itself, how it works, how it works for the user. Talk a little bit about some of the more interesting kind of technical and implementation approaches that we did in the site, and then kind of end with some learnings and plenty of time for Q&A. So the team involved in this, first of all, is UNICEF. The UNICEF headquarters in Geneva. It's a very international team. Blue State Digital, which is who I represent. We're based in New York, have offices in London and Washington, D.C., and Oakland, California, and plus a couple others. 4 Kitchens, where Jeff is from, which handled some of the more challenging Drupal technical implementation, and Motherlode Media, which is a development firm based in the UK that did a lot of the rest of the Drupal work. I guess, Jeff, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Jeff Tomlinson. Like Mike said, I work at 4 Kitchens, where I'm an architect. 4 Kitchens were distributed, so I actually live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the United States.
And UNICEF, you've probably heard of UNICEF. It's actually the case that UNICEF's kind of brand penetration beyond the name is not terribly great. And so in case you don't know, they are the UN's childhood poverty organization. In the US, they're mostly associated with these things you carry around on Halloween to raise money, but they are a lot more than that internationally. And the interesting part of UNICEF is that they have very strong country offices, and so each of the major developed countries has their own organization. UNICEF in the USA is a very powerful organization, kind of in a sense kind of rivals the UNICEF headquarters, and does its own thing with technology, has its own organization, kind of has its own priorities, raises money for itself, which is important for this project. And that's the case for about 30 or 40 of the most developed countries in the world, including almost every country in Europe. The small countries rely on the headquarters more for fundraising. They don't have an in-country presence and their own staff. And the small countries either will have pieced together a little tiny bit of technology, a CMS, and maybe some fundraising technology, but are much more likely to kind of rely on whatever the catch-all technology is that's provided by the UNICEF headquarters. The UNICEF's history with Drupal has been kind of evolving a lot recently. About a year or a little more ago, unicef.org moved to Drupal after a kind of extensive process of choosing the right CMS and rebuilding the site into Drupal. Blue State Digital was involved in kind of making sure that CMS evaluation that kind of made sure that Drupal was the right CMS and had all the features that were needed for that. That made the selection of Drupal for this project a pretty easy choice, because the rest of the unicef.org website is on Drupal. Shouldn't the fundraising platform also be Drupal? The Drupal 7 versus 8 conversation was a little bit harder, as it tends to be, because there was an existing site that we were replacing, support unicef.org, that was in Drupal 7, and it was just a conversation about the additional work that would be required to build this fundraising platform in Drupal 8 instead of Drupal 7, although we did eventually decide to do that. So a little bit about the business need for this platform. Like I said, the UNICEF local country offices have their own technology and are very strong. And so the US fund for UNICEF, their US arm, doesn't really care to have UNICEF's headquarters playing a big role in fundraising. They're not interested in the help. And that goes for all the countries in Europe as well. But there is this unfilled need that we help them see and then help them close with this project in a couple of key areas. One is corporate fundraising. UNICEF does a lot of partnerships like Louis Vuitton, big multinational companies that want to raise money on behalf of UNICEF, and the process to do that with each country having its own system is very arduous. It's a weeks-long process of coordinating and lots of emails back and forth for each country to set up their own page, and the experience to the corporate entity that's on the other side trying to help UNICEF is not pleasant. And at the end of the day, what you get is a couple countries that will participate in this, but no kind of global presence for this partnership. So one of the areas that we aim to close with this is the ability to provide global partnership pages for organizations like Louis Vuitton to raise money for UNICEF. The second is in global emergencies. In the event of a tsunami or a hurricane, those first few minutes and hours are crucial. There is a lot of money that comes into UNICEF and other organizations in those moments, and the same coordination problem on the corporate side happens with global emergencies. And so UNICEF needs one URL that they can use globally, that they can publish in minutes after one of these emergencies and have that usable globally in local languages and in local payment methods. And then the third is global campaigns like World Children's Day, but kind of these global moments where, again, that coordination barrier for each country having its own pages and technology is kind of too much to bear. And so how did we solve this with the UNICEF fundraising platform? In this example, a user will come see an ad on Facebook to donate to UNICEF. They will click on it, and as they hit the page, they will use their IP to determine what country they're in, and their browser settings first to determine what language to display the page in. And UNICEF has 7 default languages that are supported on the site, and if your browser is set to one of those, we'll display it in that language, and we'll choose what currency to display the form in based on the country that you're in. We also have the ability to do other things to the form based on the countries, such as some countries require a tax ID number or a social security number to make charitable giving, and that is a country-specific form element that can be added on the page. Then you'll go through the donation flow, just like every other donation flow that you've seen, and make the donation. One of the things we'll talk about a lot is Stripe, which is the payment processor behind this platform. We'll get into it in more detail, but it handles all the behind-the-scenes credit card processing. And another thing that it does is really easily allows you to add Google Pay and Apple Pay as payment options. If you're not familiar with these, they are coming soon to nonprofit experiences near you. It's really, it's not a pop-up. It's kind of a modal or module kind of within the experience. And if your credit card information is saved in Google Chrome, for example, that will be there when you press the pay button, and it can use that. And so it really does take the donation experience from kind of having to enter your credit card information into a mobile phone, which is very, very hard, and you lose a lot of conversions, to detecting whether your credit card information is saved in the browser, showing you this modal and allowing you to click. And Stripe, as the processor, has made that very easy to add to your website. So now I'll turn over to Jeff to talk about some of the more interesting kind of technical elements that are behind the site.
Okay, I want to start out by saying that, or emphasizing that this site, from an architecture standpoint within Drupal, is relatively simple. It's a couple of content types, and some contrib modules and a little bit of your typical Drupal glue on top of that. But I actually think that speaks to the power of Drupal and the Drupal ecosystem, that we were able to do a platform like this relatively simply. So let's talk about some of the requirements, the technical requirements that we needed to meet. So one was UNICEF headquarters staff needed to be able to create template-based campaign pages for global campaigns and emergencies. The same staff should have global editorial permissions on the site. Now the country offices, they needed a different level of permissions, and they needed more granular editorial permissions for their respective regions. They should be able to quickly clone a global campaign page and customize it for their own regional audiences. And potential donors, the people visiting the site, should be served these regionally specific pages if they exist for the locale that the donor resides in. And then donations made via a regional page needed to be accountable to the country office, but also to the national committee or the regional office, the country office or national committee, as well as to the parent global campaign page that it was cloned from. So let's look at the workflow for this really quick. So in the event of a global emergency, administrators at UNICEF headquarters publish a campaign page for the crisis. They select an image, add some text, define some default donation amounts for the page. The country office then determines they'd like to localize a localized version of that page. So they create a clone of it, and we're using the group module for this. So all of the country-specific information and pages are managed within groups using the group module. Then the country editors can then modify content, translations, donation amounts accordingly for their country. A user visiting from that country will be redirected to that regional page. Donations will be logged to the parent global campaign, and country offices also have the ability to publish their own localized campaign pages that aren't cloned from a global page. So we also had both internationalization and localization requirements. So we're dealing with multilingual and multilocale. Campaign pages are translatable into multiple languages globally and regionally. Content and options like currency, donation amounts need to be localized for individual countries. Global admins have editorial control over global campaigns and regional campaigns. And country offices have editorial control over their own regional campaigns. So for multilingual support, as Mike mentioned, there's globally supported UN languages, so we need support for that. Each participating country office would additionally support regional languages for translations when cloning a global page. Here again, the group module is used for managing regionally specific language support by defining supported languages within the group. The group module also allowed us to manage other settings unique to a country, such as currency, specialized donation form fields, default donation amounts, and Stripe account details. A bit of custom development on top of this, simplified translation interfaces by only exposing relevant languages when creating a regionally specific campaign page. For example, a campaign page for the Kenyan office produces translations in Swahili and English, while the Swiss office produces translations in French, German, and Italian. Language negotiation is handled by Drupal within the application, but also we do it in the varnish, where we have a cookie, we look for a cookie or a browser language preferences in the request. So the workflow looks a little bit like this for a user and finding out what their preferred language is and the country they're from. So first, we determine a user's country, and again, we look for a cookie that may have been set for the user. Falling back on that, we use an IP lookup that's provided by Acquia's GeoIP service, but that's available in the request header. Language selection similarly starts by checking for a cookie, which falls through to the language defined by their browser, And then failing that, then we have also, using group, we have defined a default language for the country, and so we'll go to that. If we're unable to find a matching translation for the user for a given campaign page, we present them with a page in its default language. They will then have the option to select one of the other translations available for that page. Once we determine the user's language and location, we're able to present them with a page in their preferred language with a donation form configured for their country, including their local currency, default donation amounts for that country, for that currency, and regionally defined form fields. Locale negotiation handled in varnish caching layer using, is handled in the varnish caching layer using cookie value or the GeoIP header, again from Acquia. So another thing we needed to look at was performance. As Mike mentioned, like the moments after a crisis hits are key, and we can't afford to have any performance issues that might affect donations negatively. So slow site performance for donors, especially during disasters, can result in reduced donations. We needed to develop a strategy to deliver internationalized and localized content to potential donors while minimizing performance-based friction. So first of all donor traffic is anonymous, so that allows us to rely heavily on Varnish for cached responses. We can maximize cache hits in Varnish by handling language and locale negotiation as much as possible in the Varnish configuration. So internationalized content on the site uses a path prefix, and because we use the language prefix in the path, we ensure that we have unique paths for each language, and therefore internationalized content is cached independently. A user's language is determined via the browser's accept language header or a cookie that has been set on subsequent requests. We use this information to rewrite the request path in Varnish before the cache lookup. Localized content relies on a country value in the header, in our case, again, provided by Acquia's GeoIP service. Varying the cache on the country ensures that content is further cached per locale. And similar to language negotiation, we first check for the GeoIP value or a cookie in the event that it's been overridden by the user. Then within Drupal, provided we don't get a cache hit in Varnish, custom cache handling also ensures internal page caches with granularity for locale and for language. And then lastly, donation transactions, just by virtue of using Stripe, are handled asynchronously with the embedded Stripe forms.
I wanted to just touch really quickly on GDPR and part of our approach to that. This platform was launched right before GDPR came into effect, and in addition to having a whole bunch of UNICEF lawyers involved in the process, one of the things that we did to kind of limit our GDPR exposure, our footprint, is this platform does not store any PII. And for someone who has worked on donation platforms like this for a long time, that was a little bit of a hard thing to kind of get my head around. Are we really proposing having a donation platform with a database behind it that does not have any PII in it? But really, as we thought through it, this approach that we took of using hashed values for the PII really maintains the most important parts of the data without the most risky parts, which is the PII itself. And so if you're not familiar with it, hashing is a way to take a value and create a hash, an alphanumeric representation of it that will be the same every time you put it into that function, but is irreversible. And so my email address comes up with that hash, and Jeff's comes up with that hash every single time you put the value into that, but it cannot be reversed. Given that hash value, you can't get back out the email address. And I'm okay at math. I still can't quite get my head around why there's a function that creates the same hash, but it can't be reversed, but that is the case. And so what that allows us to do is we can use the hash value as if it were the email address. We can use it for individual level reporting, for aggregates, and the only missing piece, which is anything that you do need the PII for, that is still stored in Stripe. So we can get we can get the PII for CRMs and databases of record through Stripe. And so that's another thing we wanted to touch on, is the integration path for that data into the CRMs and the databases of record. And so each of these countries has its own CRM. A bunch of them use Donor Perfect, a couple of them use Salesforce, but every country is very interested in getting the donations that have come through this platform into their CRM. And so the way that we can do that with Stripe, and also without having the PII in our system, is using the Stripe webhooks. And so a donation will come into the site, it'll get processed against Stripe, Stripe returns a success or a decline, we'll write the hashed PII along with that donation amount and the success, and we'll write that back to our Drupal database, and then we'll use Stripe's webhooks to asynchronously get that data out of Stripe, transform it in whatever way we need to, and then write it off to a CRM, Salesforce using the API, or some of the other systems using flat files that you can download. And so that's a very nice way of making this platform, giving it the capability to integrate with a lot of these other systems without storing the PII. So a couple of key learnings and results. Nonprofit groups would traditionally buy an off-the-shelf platform, and there is good reason for that. It is the kind of thing that is largely repeatable, and in that sense, it does make sense to look for a vendor to do this kind of work. However, the cost of building it yourself, the buy versus build trade-off, is changing really dramatically with Drupal and with Stripe. Gives you a very easy path to building a fundraising website without needing to involve a vendor. And so in UNICEF's case, the custom functionality, this stuff around routing the donor to the right page, around cloning a page and localizing it to the country, was more than we felt that any of the off-the-shelf systems could handle, and made sense for the custom build. And that has gotten a lot easier. I don't think you can imagine doing a project like this just a couple years ago. And what that also gives you is the flexibility to build kind of a best-in-class user experience. To build the user experience is totally within your control. You're not using wrappers against the vendor's page where you're kind of mushing around the CSS to make it look like you want. This is a regular Drupal website that gives you all of that control. And it also gives UNICEF a platform where it's kind of small and medium-sized countries can grow into this platform, and we can add, for example, local payment methods to the platform over time. And so instead of these smaller countries getting their own local technology that is insecure and doesn't have a great user experience, we will grow them into this platform over time.
And just a few of the kind of technical learnings that we had. One thing, this is my first time using Group module, and I just found that it's a really excellent, lighter weight version of organic groups. It really provided us the ability to manage a lot of the country-specific information locally. And again, the simplicity of the architecture was we had a single group type for country, and that handled a lot of the logic for group-specific or country-specific data. Also, just learned it's possible to have a performant, semi-customized donor experience by handling the language and locale negotiation out at the edge within Varnish, within the Varnish configuration. And then Stripe's API and webhooks are really powerful, and they just allowed us a relatively easy means to decouple payment processing and offload a lot of the security concerns that Mike talked about.
Here's our standard contribute to Drupal slide. And with that, I think we have a little time for questions.
It's related to using group. I was just curious about what kind of other benefits do you get from using that, and why not just a taxonomy term, for example?
I'm sorry, can you repeat about the group?
How is it actually used? Why not just, if it's just for like country selection, why not just use a taxonomy term, for example?
It allowed us to have, so yeah, we're using it just for country selection. So we actually generated a group for every single country in the world, I believe, so that they have the option of enabling those things eventually as other countries come online. One thing that I liked about it was just the granular permissioning that using group allowed, that you can sort of work around those things with taxonomy, but group kind of like tied that up nicely.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. No other questions? All right. Thank you very much.